Welcome. This is Thursday live critique. I got some images today, some submissions from a dear friend, and I forgot to ask her if she would be okay with me saying her name. So I'll just say that she's a dear friend. And if I do get permission from her to say her name and share her Instagram profile, I will do so in the comments. So if you're interested in seeing more of her work after this is done, keep an eye on the comments, and I'll post her Instagram account there. So I'm actually just going to jump right into it. She gave me 5 images to talk about. I think there are some things worth talking about in all 5. So I will try to not ramble. I know I am prone to ramble when I get to thinking out loud. So I'm going to switch over to my screen here. All right. So I wanted to start with this painting because there's really not any kind of I think it's great the way it is, and I wanted to point out just a couple things that I thought were especially good. There's a really nice mood about the painting. I wanted to bring up. I'm going to attempt to do something that might be a little tedious. Hold with me here. I'm going to bring this up, and hopefully you can kind of see that on your screen. I'm going to try to explain a histogram. So if you aren't familiar with Photoshop and histograms, stay with me. Try to hold on here. So this little this little formation, this little blotch of white right here, represents this image that we're looking at, this painting. This on the far left of that splotch of white is a little arrow, and I don't know if that's going to be visible on your screen, but it's a black arrow. On the far right of that big splotch is a white arrow, and then the middle is gray. So what this histogram represents is basically a bar chart. So on the horizontal axis, we've got black to white, and then up and down, we have how much information in this image exists on that scale of black to white. All right. So what this is telling me, this histogram is telling me that I've got a spike of values or amounts of light in this part, in the middle part of the spectrum, and a spike down at the lower end, and very little value or very little information in the image is up here in the light grays all the way to white, right? Why I wanted to point that out is because there's not very much contrast in this painting. And typically when we want to represent space, three-dimensional space or three-dimensional objects, we want that full range of contrast from white to black, because that is what's going to communicate the illusion of three dimension, how light is interacting with space. If we don't have very much value contrast, we tend to not get as much depth or as much spatial, like a third dimension. But in this case, there's not a lot of contrast, meaning there's not a lot of lights to contrast with all those darks and mid value dark. But it's okay. We don't get as much space. We don't get as much depth and roundness, but there's this really nice mood, this kind of that dark, low contrast feel has just an excellent kind of somber, still, peaceful mood. So I thought it would be worth pointing out that this is all kind of in that low key, low register, darker values, kind of mid gray, all the way down to black. That's kind of where the majority of this image sits. And I think there's a really nice mood because of that. The other thing that I wanted to point out in this particular painting that I thought was nice is she invokes some interesting geometry. I've talked about geometry in the past with regard to Degas, I think a couple of weeks ago, and how he activated different kinds of division of space. So we've got the rectangle format, the rectangle of the image of the picture, and we can invoke or tie into really strong divisions of that rectangle. One of those strong divisions is a square. So in this case, she does an excellent job of kind of tying in to square. So I'm going to draw a square right here. I will, I'm going to stroke it. Okay. So we've got this square, and then I'm going to draw diagonals across that square. And I'm not going to go into too much depth here. But notice how these two flowers, they're a very strong vertical shape right here. Together, they comprise this kind of vertical shape. It's off center, so it's not right in the center. And actually, on the left-hand side of those flowers, it probably sits on the third. But there's kind of an interesting thing that happens here in the kind of gesture of these leaves on the top of this lower flower. Invoke or kind of fall the midpoint of that diagonal, right, that bisects those two sides of this flower, the top of the flower, sit right on that strong diagonal line of the square. Also, the top of this leaf right here, that leaf right there, I'm going to change that brush back. Should have done that already. Okay. Okay, so, sorry guys. I don't want that. Okay, so that line picks up that geometry of the square. And notice how up here, there's this symmetry that happens with that corner being dark and this corner being dark. That also kind of invokes or kind of suggests that geometry. And then finally, this little guy right here, the leaf that's coming up from the flower also sits on that diagonal. I could go into other ways that this painting kind of invokes that square. Oh, the other thing here is that kind of where the water meets the shore, kind of a suggestion here. It's kind of hard to see. And then this leaf right here also sits along that square line. There's some other things happening kind of in the lower square and where those diagonals hit the flower. I don't want to spend too much time on that today. I just wanted to point out that intentionally or not, she's picking up, and a lot of times we do this just intuitively, right? We put things in positions that just kind of feel right to us. But I think it's worthwhile kind of point out sometimes how we invoke or tie into these strong geometries, these strong divisions of space, and how we organize and compose the subject matter in our paintings. Okay, so I'm going to move off of that and go to this painting. So actually, I'm going to skip that painting for the moment. This painting, and I should say before getting into suggestions here, that I think all of these paintings are really strong. I think you could leave them alone. They feel complete. They don't necessarily feel like they're missing anything. I'm going to make some suggestions today that I think might be instructive and things that you might want to pay attention for future paintings. But I think all of these, they feel really strong. They feel complete. I don't know necessarily that you need to go in and make any of these changes. And you know, again, these are meant to be instructive. They're not necessarily gospel. You don't need to go in and like make all these changes just because I bring them up here. All right. So the one thing that I wanted to say about here, we've got these two really strong, high contrast shapes. We got this girl here looking up at this statue. And that dynamic is nice, and it creates this kind of triangular grouping between those two. These kind of feel like a pair, not just as subject matter, but in how they kind of stand out next to this monochromatic background. It's kind of all green background. What I wonder with this one is if we could use that background to create more movement or to help frame or divide up that background into more interesting, smaller or kind of medium-sized shapes. Right now, it just feels like one big dark block. Not necessarily a problem, and this is, again, I think you can leave it as is and have it be just fine. Right now, they're just, it's this big, dense, continuous green background. So what I've done here, and I'm just going to turn on this layer, is I wonder if you were to bring in just some sky into that composition, that would kind of break down the I don't know. Again, density is the word that comes to mind. Just the heaviness and monolithic, monochrome green background. Break it up into more interesting shapes, and also just start creating more movement. And you know, guys, I messed with my brush, and I'm not exactly okay. That's good enough. Okay, so this kind of putting a break as if there were trees in the background would help divide up that green background. Also invoke this strong third line that kind of divides these two figures here. You could also kind of start getting some more kind of a diagonal on the top of the trees that might help, you know, create more movement out to the corners. So that would be my only recommendation. Think of how you might use this negative space more as a way to create more asymmetry, to invoke these different kinds of divisions of space that might be more compelling. It just feels like this background could be used perhaps more effectively. The other thing that you could do to accomplish a similar thing, let's see, I'm going to actually make a new layer, would be if you didn't want to bring any sky in there, maybe just bringing in a little bit more differentiation on the foliage in the leaves. So I'm not going to do a good job here of these are not convincing leaves. But if you were to bring kind of highlights on top of the leaves, or maybe a different color of leaf, just more contrast, it looks like you're kind of doing that in making these foreground plants thicker. So the paint application is a little bit thicker. That might help, maybe going a little bit further with that idea. And let me try going further with that same idea. And maybe just having, I can't tell what kind of plant this is in the background. It's kind of long leaves. But having just a little bit more contrast between these different kinds of plant and foliage in the background could be used to, again, get us moving around the image, using that negative space in a way to help create a kind of cycle or circulation around the image. You are doing that a little bit in making it darker on the right-hand side. So there's this gradient that moves us from left to right. But again, I think more could be done perhaps with that background to get us moving around. I could talk a little bit about light logic. I'm not going to do that today because I think there are some other paintings that I would like to pay attention to. But keep in mind, keep track of your light source and make sure that it's consistently hitting these illusionistic three-dimensional objects in space, right? So if your light source is coming from top left, which it looks like it is, there would be some light fall off, probably less light on this arm. This baby would be casting probably more of a shadow on the figure of the woman. So just keep track of that. So that, I think, is all I wanted to suggest about this one, about that one. This one, a couple really nice things about it are, let's see, I'm going to choose a more contrasting color so you can see what I'm doing. So there's this really nice gesture happening, this nice movement coming from top left all the way down here, and then you've got this other nice strong line coming across here. And what those two lines do, notice, so we've got this one and this one, is it breaks up the whole composition kind of into these these quadrants or these four different parts, and you kind of have a maybe a large, medium, a little bit smaller, and then smallest. So there's a nice variety in terms of just how you're implying a division of that rectangle. And you're simply accomplishing that by how you're placing the figure within the composition. So I think that was a really good choice. And you're also activating the diagonal, which is much more active than if you were to put the figure vertical or horizontal. So nice things happening there. A couple red flags, and this is something that I've mentioned in the past, but there are 2 points right down here. Oh, goodness. Somehow I activated a mask on my brush, and I'm not even sure how I did that. Okay, I'll have to figure that out later. There are 2 points that are kind of red flags. One is this foot. I've talked about the, I guess, the danger of having one of your primary subject matter come into contact with the border of your composition at a tangent. So see how these toes kind of touch the edge of the composition. And again, it's not against the law. You can do it. But what it tends to do is draw our attention to the border, to the format. So rather than feeling like a window into some other scene, it starts to feel like a constraint or a box that confines this or restricts this figure. Up here at the top, I like how you let that elbow just get cropped off. Let it go off the scene. Over here, again, what's happening is these fingers are coming pretty close right there to the edge of the composition. And it's kind of drawing our attention or creates this tension between the border and these parts of the body that come right up and touch the edge there. And I think just unnecessarily create focal points or draw our attention to part of the composition that maybe is not really intended. So instead of doing that, let's go down and take a look at this foot. I'm going to mess with the anatomy here a little bit. Oh my goodness, why can't I get that? Why can't I get that to go away? So, aha, I did not notice something. Okay, so I think I just fixed the problem. I had it on a wet brush, which I am not familiar with. Okay, a couple things here with the anatomy. There's not a clear kind of indication of the calf muscle going into. Usually there's kind of a bump right there where the ankle is. And then we've kind of got the arch top of the foot that goes down. And then this would be your heel. So we could kind of solidify some of what's happening there just in terms of the anatomy of the foot. But I think I would just probably let the foot just go off the page and not have those toes appear. Yeah, I think with the length of the leg here, my suspicion is that foot would be probably going off the page. Up here with the fingers, again, probably need to clarify some of the anatomy, and maybe you could just simplify what's going on there. The other option here is when it could happen that you're making a painting of a person or an object, and it could happen just by chance that's where the finger is, right? I did all the anatomy correctly, everything's in proportion, and my finger ended up right here on the edge. So in that situation, when that's the way the subject, the size of the subject is, I don't want to repaint and repose my figure or reposition the figure in the composition. What I would suggest in that instance is just decrease the contrast at that point of the image. So in this case, maybe what I would want to do is let's see, take a little bit of this background color. Whoops, that's a little bit too strong. Let me pull that down and soften the brush. Okay, so maybe just taking a little bit of that background color and glazing over that foot at the bottom, so we can still see it, but you see how that decrease in contrast kind of just doesn't draw our attention as much as when we've got a lot of contrast there at that point. And I would say the same thing with the hand up here. Maybe just kind of letting, as it gets toward that edge, letting the fingers kind of fade off or get darker, so there's not as much contrast at that point where the finger touches the edge of the composition. All right, so hopefully you can kind of see. I'm going to erase that little bit of dark line at the top, but hopefully you can see how just having that little dark point de-emphasizes that point of the foot and doesn't draw our attention as much to that place where the foot comes into contact with the edge. And also just letting the toes go off the image so that it doesn't feel like the toes are just touching right there at the bottom. The other thing that I was going to say here is you've got a really strong light source hitting, coming down from the bottom, hitting the legs right here, bottoms of the breast, bottom of the chin, and the arm right there. My suspicion is that you would have more contrast of light and dark on whatever this fabric is right there. It might be nice to bring a little punch of color, kind of a light value, hitting the bottom of that piece of fabric. Let me see if I can. Oh, duh. Turn my brushes up a little bit. So it might be nice. Again, that light source is coming from the bottom right, just bringing a little bit of saturated color as if that light were lighting up, this bit of fabric, and maybe even making that a lighter value to kind of make my point here. And again, this is light logic stuff. So if the body is being hit by that amount of light, then this fabric that is interacting in the same three-dimensional space would be hit by that light and probably have some highlight at the bottom. So I think you could probably and it would be an opportunity to bring a little zap of saturation in. That might be a nice contrast to this green in the background, because red and green are complements. So you'd have that kind of color contrast as well. I like that you're using the negative space here, in this case, darker on the bottom left, lighter on the top right, and that helps to emphasize the diagonal of this gesture of the figure. There are some anatomy things that I wanted to just quickly suggest beyond down here at the foot. So there are some places that you might just want to think about suggesting overlapping of three-dimensional forms. So, and I don't want to spend too much time on drawing issues here, but where this neck comes down, as it is right now, this area is a little bit nebulous of the relationship between the neck and where it connects with the torso and how it overlaps the shoulder. So even just a little bit of suggestion of this neckline coming down and being in front of that shoulder right there. It doesn't need to be this dark. I just wanted to point that out. Would help kind of solidify what's going on in here. As it is, it feels a little bit mushy. Like I don't know if this neck and the shoulder are kind of just attached right there. Maybe the neck actually comes down a little bit higher. I don't know. So clarifying what's happening there up in that part of the anatomy. Also, maybe the same could be true of where this breast comes around, clarifying how that overlaps the arm right there. And again, it's just kind of helping to define the relationship between these three-dimensional objects, so it doesn't look like it's just, like these things are running into each other, right? It looks like right now the breast kind of just runs into the arm, whereas this should be just, it's a more three-dimensional volume that is overlapping this part of the arm. So hopefully you can get a feel for what I'm talking about there. Um, the neck actually connects with the torso as kind of a cylinder and projects out the front of the torso rather than just kind of sticking off the top of the shoulders. So there are little lines, little clarifications that you can do. I'm going to maybe just leave it at that with these two. The neck overlapping the shoulder back here, and then the breast overlapping the shoulder and continuation into the arm. Those two changes would just help solidify the anatomy and make it feel more volumetric, more three-dimensional. All right. I'm trying to do too many images today, perhaps, but okay. Let me see what I've got left. These two. Okay, I'm going to actually just do two more because I've already been talking for a long time. A lot of great stuff here, and some things that I think are well worth discussing and very instructive. Okay, the thing that I wanted, this is lovely. Love this painting. Very nice mood. Anatomy-wise, very well drawn. Nothing is sticking out to me as especially problematic. The fingers are really well rendered and proportionate. It looks like you got the light logic right. See how the light on the top of the fingers here, the light that hits the top of the fingers on this hand is lighter than the light that hits this hand, which is consistent with the light that's hitting this side of the face, and there's light fall off as it goes over to the left there. Maybe a little bit more light on this side of the beard to coincide with the light on that side of the face might be in order. But really doing a really good job with issues of light logic and just drawing proportion and the anatomy of the figure. What I wanted to point out in this one that I think might be worth considering is how we're dealing with the background. So oftentimes when we are dealing, especially with portraiture or where the primary subject matter is just this kind of single person or object in the foreground, and we want the background to be kind of more just vague context. So we don't really want it to be busy with a lot of buildings or people or objects or just noise. We want it just to be a simple, kind of blurry background that suggests a mood or a context without being too literal or descriptive, which is kind of what feels like she was trying to accomplish here. There is a tendency, and I've talked about this in previous broadcasts, there's a tendency we have to kind of just evenly distribute that visual information as just kind of a texture in the background. We want it just to be vague, so we don't want it to be, we're not trying to make it look like anything per se. But the point that I wanted to make here that I think is really important is that when we do that, there's a certain expectation we have for different kinds of fuzzy information. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to say this right, but so I would expect this man looks like he's probably in some kind of city. He's got a coat on, he's playing a whistle, there's probably people around, he's probably, kind of looks like in the background there might be buildings. There's these kind of vertical lines that suggest buildings. So even though I can't see literally what is back there, I don't know what kind of building it might be, or I still kind of have an expectation of what that fuzzy information looks like, the general size and shape of what I might expect in that context. If I say if all of these things in the background were little dots or like big shapes and like a random assortment of different shapes, then it wouldn't really fit my expectation of the kind of noise or the kind of marks that I would expect to see in that context. So even though we can't see literally what it is, we still need to suggest that context, even if we're not being very literal. Hopefully I'm kind of getting the idea across. I think she is doing a really excellent job along those lines, having these vertical lines. Those vertical lines suggest buildings, right? This brown, this brown shape, and then on this side, this kind of blue shape, and then in between this shape right here, that might be kind of buildings that are much more distant that kind of just combine together. It looks like right here where this darkness turns into this kind of brownish color, that might be the bottom of the buildings. So there are some kind of suggestions of what that context might be, that this person is occupying. But what I'm seeing is that there are kind of these brush strokes and stripes that become much more kind of consistent. When in a city, I would expect that visual information to have a lot more variety. There's going to be lines of linear perspective that are going to make some windows bigger or smaller depending on how close they are to the figure. There are going to be people walking through, railings, billboards, windows, doors, some open, some closed. There are just going to be a lot more variety of different sizes and shapes in that context. So I guess what I would like to, I don't know if I have a clear statement to say here, other than avoid that tendency that all of us have to just kind of put random texture in the background, just kind of vague colors and shapes. You don't need to be definite or really descriptive in the information you put in the background, but the noise, that kind of generalized abstract stuff in the background needs to evoke the kinds of sizes and shapes and colors that we would generally expect in the context you're trying to create for your subject matter. Anyway, I think that might be a discussion better that I need more examples for to be more instructive here. But I kind of feel that in the background, I just need more convincing information back there, even if it's not going to be very descriptive. Okay, I don't feel like I did a very good job of kind of explaining myself with that, but hopefully you get kind of the idea. In this case, this will be the last one. I'm going to skip that second one, and this will be the last one I talk about today. So I think I'm trying to kind of chew off more than I ought. But I wanted to zoom in on these flowers because they are just lovely. They're really three-dimensional. Notice how that fall off. You got your primary light hitting right there on that top flower. So there's really strong, consistent light logic. Strongest light hitting right here. Second strongest, third strongest. So and then you've kind of got that strong light in the background hitting strongest up at the top right. So there's a really nice, strong, clear, consistent sense of a light source hitting these three-dimensional objects consistently, which is excellent. I think perhaps that could be clarified a little bit more in these long flower shapes. So maybe there would be more of a shadow kind of on the bottom side of these. I don't know what kind of volume those are. It looks to me like they might be kind of a round cylindrical shape that kind of tapers off toward the end, in which case they too would have more perhaps of a shadow on the underside, if I can kind of accentuate that here. And then this flower might be casting more of a shadow on that. So maybe clarifying the light logic of those flowers might help just solidify that sense of light logic. The one thing that I wanted to point out in this one, well, two things. One is this line right here that is the separation between whatever surface this vase is sitting on and either empty space that is behind that, maybe it's on a table and then this is the edge of the table, or maybe this is sitting in the corner of a room and this is the corner that between the floor and the wall. Whatever the case may be, this line right here, if we extend it all the way across, the back corner, so here's the front corner. Let me get a better color here so we can see. So the front corner of that vase is right here. The back corner, if I drew the bottom of the vase, the back corner would be somewhere kind of around there. I'm not including any, let's see, something like that. So the back corner would be right there. And if this is the line that of the edge of the table or the beginning of a wall, that corner either would be going off the table or running into the wall. Either way, it feels a little bit uncomfortable, and like the illusion of space is a little disrupted there. So in this case, the solution would be simply to move that line perhaps up a little bit higher, say right there. That's not going to be very helpful, is it? So if I put that line just a little bit higher, try to be consistent here. My computer is struggling to keep up with this. And then just bring these colors up a little bit. Okay. Yeah, sorry guys, my computer is struggling. Just to bring that up a bit. Now that vase feels like it's sitting more solidly on that surface, right? Just bringing that line up. So we got to pay attention to that. Again, it's all about this illusion. It's a two-dimensional painting, right? So there's not a vase sitting on a table. It's just paint on a two-dimensional surface. But we have to do due diligence in making sure that the illusion is consistent with our expectations of in real three-dimensional space. It's going to feel uncomfortable if that vase feels like it's going off the table in the back or poking into a solid wall. That's not going to quite make sense. We've got to make sure that that's consistent. Okay. There perhaps consistent with our light logic would be more of a shadow perhaps cast on this surface that the vase is sitting on. And then the last thing that I wanted to say with regards to this in particular, when you have a transparent vase like this, the way we know it's transparent is because we can see what's behind it, right? So in this case, I do not see any of this yellow and purpley mixture that's in the negative space around the vase. I don't see any of that reflected or present in the shape of this vase. Whereas I do feel like I'm looking through and seeing the stems of the flower inside the vase, but I would expect to see at least a little bit of these colors in the negative space occurring somewhere inside that vase if I want to get the sense of transparency. So I would just simply go through and, it doesn't have to necessarily look completely transparent. Glass, especially thick glass, refracts and reflects light in ways that kind of abstract what's going on behind it. But I would expect to see some of these kind of neutral yellows showing up in that vase shape, like over here. My computer is having a hard time keeping up. So I'd expect some of these yellows and a mixture of yellow and purple to occur in this vase shape if you want want that vase to feel more like it's interacting with that three-dimensional space, that context. Also, this really bright blue is great. I think I would want more of a sense of where that bright blue is coming from. So I don't know, maybe a suggestion of a window over here, or maybe some of that blue light kind of getting reflected on a shiny surface right here. But that the bright blue is so contrasty, and it's a really saturated blue, and it's a lot lighter value than your flowers, for example, that it really grabs my attention down here, and I kind of want to get a sense for what it's relating to or interacting with, what light source that is hitting it, or maybe just knock it back a little bit so it's not quite so dominant, so we can just be a little bit more focused on what's going on in the flowers. Also, if this is the edge of your table, then maybe having a little suggestion of where that edge is kind of sits behind the vase, right? So we can kind of see how this table is continuing, and we can see it a little bit, or it's suggested through the transparent glass of the vase. These are all just ways to, again, create this illusion that we're looking at a transparent glass vase. If this is too different than the environment that's behind it, then it's not going to appear like this vase or this glass is transparent, and it's going to look a little bit disjoint, and we're not going to get a clear. It's just going to be confusing. All right, so that's kind of what I wanted to say about this. I could spend more time, messing around with maybe clarifying the light logic. I think perhaps a little bit more contrast here on the right side might help make these lighter purple flowers stand out more. But really, what I wanted to point out is primarily this division of, in the background, clarifying the relationship of the volume of the vase in a three-dimensional context, making sure that we don't contradict or, have that back of the vase either hanging off the table or poking into a wall, and then kind of working with how to suggest transparency. I like how these leaves are really sharp and contrasty, and they help guide our attention to these flowers. The flowers are so soft that it's easy to kind of get pulled away to sharper, harder edges and higher contrast. So having these leaves kind of frame these soft flowers is an interesting choice, and successful in helping to reinforce that as the primary subject matter, primary focal point. All right. So I think I'm going to end it there. Stop with four images for the day. Thank you so much for sending in these images. I think I'm going to reiterate. I think all of them are really strong. All of them could stay as they are. Hopefully, some of these suggestions were just instructive for future reference, and helping to kind of, helping you with future paintings. This Thursday broadcast is going to continue. I'm really enjoying doing it. If you have any images that you would like to submit, you can submit them to me at dabbleon@gmail.com. That's dabbleon.com. No, dabbleon@gmail.com. I would love it if they were currently or works in progress or recently completed. I think there's some value in sharing that kind of work, because it kind of inspires all of us to get out there and make stuff and see that and be inspired that other people are out there making work. So that being said, if you have any images that you'd like critiqued or talked about, I'd be happy to look at them. And that's about it. Thanks for joining me. I'm actually going to go back to the Facebook group real quick before I sign off. And awesome. Thanks for everybody that joined live. It makes such a big difference to me psychologically, knowing that people are out there with me, and I'm not just talking into the ether to nobody. So thank you so much for joining me, and I look forward to talking more about art next week. If I don't get any submissions, I will just be picking up either old artists or artists that I'm following on Instagram or yeah, other places, and just look in and critique those artists. So see you next Thursday. I think that's all for today. Thanks, everyone. Signing off now.